safe. Okay. We are going to today try to make our way through a couple of brief ideas related to Parshas B'Shalach, this week's Parsha. This is quite a Parsha to come back for. There's literally, I don't know, there's enough material in this Parsha to give an entire year's worth of Parsha classes, especially if you only meet for half an hour. But even I think if we were to meet for an hour, there would just be enough information to go on and on. So what I'd like to do is really focus on what I guess I would say is the main event of this week's Parsha, of course, and that is Kriyat Yam Suf, which is the splitting of the Red Sea, the real climax of the Jewish people's leaving Egypt. And of course, we know we've got 40 years in the desert coming and many, many other incidents. Even in just this week's Parsha, we have so many stories, incidents that are worth discussing and studying in depth, learning the lessons that come from them. But I've recently, since we've been away for so long, and we have, as many of you probably are aware, we're on what we've been calling a COVID merry-go-round, where this lovely, crazy virus is just cycling its way through our family and taking its sweet time about allowing that to happen. So I've had more time than usual to daven, to spend some time on Shacharis and Mincha. And one of the things that I have noticed is that I struggle particularly with the Tefillah of Az Yashir. And the Tefillah of Az Yashir, which of course discusses in detail, it is essentially all of the psukim that are lifted directly from this week's Parsha and placed in our daily Tefillah, in our Siddur, and something that we are intended to say every single day. And of course, this begs the question, what could be so important, so significant, that when they put the Siddur together, the sages decided that this was a must. Now, we know that there are a lot of significant events that happen to the Jewish people that we do a very good, consistent job of commemorating, right? We have the different chagim that commemorate the different events that took place in our history. Every time we face annihilation and we are saved, we mark it by having a chag, by having a holiday, celebrating, learning about it, etc. But when something is meant to be sort of drilled into us, when it's something that we are supposed to be saying every single day, right? Along the lines of Shema, right? It's always worth studying the lines, the beautiful psukim of Shema. Why is that something that we say several times a day, not just once, but several times a day? But along the same lines, I noticed, I think it's that I don't always have the opportunity to say Az Yashir, but with this extended tefillah time that I have had over the last number of weeks, and I've been saying Az Yashir, so I've really been bothered by why did Chazal feel the need to add this to our daily routine? Wouldn't it have been enough to give me a summary or to just lift a couple of the psukim out so that I would remember Kriyas Yam Suf? I would remember the miracle that Hashem did for the Jewish people. It's quite a big one. And I think, it's one of those really memorable ones. In fact, somehow I think it's almost easier to relate to than the giving of the Torah itself, where it's so hard to picture what took place, but we all can sort of, maybe with the help of the 10 Commandments and Charlton Heston, maybe we have an easier time picturing, relating to the splitting of the sea. We can't maybe imagine it happening, but in our minds, we could picture such a thing. And so I thought it would be worth it to just try to explore a little bit. Why is it that this tefillah takes up so much real estate in our siddur? Why is it such a relevant part of our daily routine? And so I actually had this really unique opportunity. As I mentioned, we are staying in our aunt and uncle's house in Long Island. They are away very conveniently. Unfortunately, I believe they also have COVID where they are. But now we're in their house dealing with our version of the virus. And this is my husband's uncle. And he has quite a collection of svarim from his father. Zichrono Livracha, and his father, my husband's grandfather, was a chassid of all chassidim, he used to say, but he often would refer to the Imre Yehuda as his Rebbe. I thought I had the Sefer in front of me, but I don't. It's a different Chumash. And so we have some in our house. I think all of the grandchildren and children have different versions, but I just felt like, okay, if I'm going to be in a Freundlich house, I should make use of the fact that there is the Sefer of the Imre Yehuda here. And so I think it's a special privilege to be able to share an idea from the Imre Yehuda, from one of his original svarim. The Sefer itself is so you could tell how old it is just by touching the pages. You can feel the print on the page. I don't remember the last time I touched a book where you could feel the raised print on the page. I wasn't able to do the math. It only printed the Hebrew year that the Sefer was printed. And I didn't do the math yet to know when it was printed, but it had to have been a while ago. So one quick idea I want to share from the Imre Yehuda with you, and then I'd like to sort of pull back a little bit and look at sort of the broader idea of Az Yashir. So the Imre Yehuda says that in general, human beings have limited capacity. We're aware of this, of course, but they specifically are even limited when it comes to their imagination. He says that if you were to meet somebody who was very, very poor, very down on their luck financially, and they were extraordinarily living in extraordinarily difficult conditions, real poverty, and you would ask them to imagine what would it be like if you were extraordinarily wealthy? What would it be like? Can you just imagine it? So he says, of course, every poor person can imagine what it's like to be rich, but their image of what it would mean to not be poor, and in their mind, the opposite of whatever they're experiencing, right, would be rich, doesn't even come close to the amount of potential wealth that a person could possibly have. Whereas if you were to ask a person who was fairly comfortable, even a little bit on the wealthy side, can you imagine in your mind, can you picture what it would be like if you were very, very wealthy, if you were extraordinarily wealthy? That person would have a much easier time relating to that concept. And it's because whatever the mind can only grasp so much more than what is in plain sight in front of us in the moment. And so the very poor person can't even imagine the type of wealth that a comfortable person could imagine. And he brings a couple of examples. He brings the same example with somebody who's not well, right? Somebody who's suffering a lot physically, has an illness of some sort that's affecting them. Tell them, imagine what it would be like to be healthy. Imagine that person, even when they're dreaming of what it would be like to not be ill, they can't fathom, they can't even in their mind's eye be able to picture what it would be like to not just be pain-free, to not just be worrying about their health all the time, to not be worried about their health all the time, but to be like a superstar athlete, to be at, tip-top shape. They can't imagine that. Whereas the person who is moderately healthy, gets a cold every once in a while, maybe isn't in the best shape, but that person could actually imagine more. If that person exercises relatively often or, has some kind of decent physical shape, they would be able to imagine what it means to be like really a specimen of good health. And so the Imre Yehuda says that it's for this reason why some of the things that we say in Az Yashir that are written in the Torah are written in the way that they are written. What he specifically explains is the Medrash, Chazal tell us, a very famous line that you may have heard, that what a shifcha, what a handmaid, what a woman servant saw when the Jewish people crossed the Yam Suf, it was the likes of which even the Navi Yecheskel, Ezekiel the prophet, he never could have dreamed up such a thing. And in explaining that line, the Imre Yehuda tells us that was the miracle, or I shouldn't say the miracle, but that was one aspect of the miracle of Kriyas Yam Suf. That even though the human being is naturally limited in their capacity to imagine something so much more than what they have, a little bit above what they have, maybe even a moderate amount, but a full extreme 180 degrees, they're not able to do it. They simply can't wrap their heads around it. Even in just using their imagination, they can't. That was one of the miracles of the Yam Suf. It's an idea I never even thought of. And I certainly, even though I've heard this line so many times, I've never thought about it in these terms before. That the miracle was that the Jewish people, who themselves were so limited at that time, they had suffered so much physically, psychologically, spiritually, they were not necessarily at their height. And yet they were able to envision themselves, to see themselves the greatest version of themselves that they could possibly be, which normally is impossible. If we're an average person spiritually, like we do a decent job, we try to do the right thing, but we're a little far from perfection. That's okay. So we can only imagine, like, what would it mean if I was like the best version of myself? Okay, I would picture only up to a certain amount, only the things that I could relate to. It says the Imre Yehuda, the gift of Kriyas Yamsuf was that it gave the Jewish people, a group of people who were inherently so downtrodden, it allowed them to dream big, to aspire, to like picture the impossible, and to actually be able to envision themselves doing great things. And the Imre Yehuda says that's why everything is written, especially in the beginning of Az Yashir, that the Jewish people will sing, even though it's recorded in actual time, or it's written, I should say, in actual time. This is what the Jewish people saw. This is how the Mitzrim suffered. This is the way they drowned, and all of those things. But it talks very much, when it refers to the song of the Jewish people, as Yashir Moshe Ubnei Yisrael, the Jewish people will sing. This is one explanation. There are many others, as well as later on when we see the beautiful song of Miriam and the women. It's Ashira Lashem Ki Ga'oga'a. Ashira, I will sing to Hashem Ki Ga'oga'a. Even though he is so beyond my comprehension, I'm actually going to be able to sing to him because I've been given this gift of being able to imagine myself so far greater than I ever really should be able to imagine myself. And then I thought that was just a beautiful idea. We can all certainly use a little extra boost, a little extra hope. And for me, this gave me a little something interesting to sort of focus on when I'm saying Az Yashir, that this was one of the things that we commemorate when we recite Az Yashir on a daily basis. This is something we can relate to. Hashem, help me to dream bigger, right? I want to think big. I want to do good in this world. I don't just want to help the people on my block or in my neighborhood. I want to help the whole world. Like, I want to leave my mark on the Jewish people. I want to make this place I want to leave, something more substantial than what I could ever have dreamed I'd be capable of. Help me to dream big. And that was one of the miracles of Kriyas Yamsuf. So that was one idea that I wanted to share. I wanted to point out something else that I noticed for the first time. Great things happen when you read through the Parsha. I noticed for the first time, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but we have in our minds the image, usually of Charlton Heston, extending his hand with his staff in it. Hashem tells him that's going to be necessary in order for the waters to split. And then once Moshe does that, the miracle will begin. The waters will begin to split. That's what Hashem tells Moshe to do. And of course, that is what he does. But what I had missed in previous readings of the Parsha is that in order for the water to come back to itself, for the walls to collapse, and what eventually, of course, leads to the drowning of all the Egyptians, that Moshe himself, Hashem tells him that he is going to need to extend his staff again in order to draw the water back. And I'm looking for it in the Psukim. And of course, I don't see it because I turned the page when I shouldn't have. Here we go. This is Parak Yotzalad Pasuk Chav Zayin. Vayetz Moshe es yado al hayam. He extends his hand over the waters. Vayashav hayam lifnot boker le'itano. Come the morning, the water returned le'itano, to its strength. Umitzrayim nasim likrato. And in this totally bizarre image, the Egyptians, it's as though they're rushing to greet the water that is now converging back on itself. Like it's all falling back into the ocean floor. And it's as though the Egyptians are running towards it in what must have been just a most bizarre scene. And of course, we know what happens is that the Egyptians end up, of course, they all drown. There are no survivors from anybody who was in the water, as far as we can tell. And as you know, from reading these psukim from Az Yashir, it describes in great detail, very poetic detail, the experience that the Egyptians must have had in the water, how they would rise and then fall again, and the experience of the chariots and the horses and the soldiers themselves, and how they were like led in the water. Very, very descriptive. And I'll be honest, that's one of the things that I find often challenging to say on a daily basis is it's lo naim, as we say. It's not so pleasant to read about the demise and the destruction of people, even though they were evil people, and even though they were seeking out our destruction. We're not a people who generally celebrates the fall of our enemies. We celebrate our being saved, but we try to minimize in general the pain that other people suffer. I don't mean minimize. I mean, we try to not focus. We try to not celebrate the pain even of our enemies. And so that's always been something that's fascinating. And to me, the added idea here that Moshe was the one who had to actually, I guess we would say indirectly, cause the death of all of these Egyptians is something that is worth noting. And I think it's probably a lesson that is difficult to hear sometimes and hard to swallow because, like I said, we don't like to see people suffer. We're sensitive people, we're caring people. And even though we know that there are bad people out there and we don't want them to harm anybody, we also don't typically enjoy seeing them suffer. And I think what we are told here is that this is not something, it's not a matter of enjoyment. It's that you can't look away from it because we have to recognize the tremendous miracle that this was, in that it gave the Jewish people a closure. It gave them an ability when they crossed over to the other side of the Yam Suf and they looked back and they see slowly but surely all the Egyptians drowning. And then they start to see them washing up on the shore. As horrifying as that must have been, there is probably also nothing that would have given them the ability to recover from their traumatic experience of having been slaves in Mitzrayim and having been chased through the desert than seeing their enemies washed up on the shore. My husband, I was asking him what he thought about this, and he said something interesting. Of course, we're always relating these ideas in the Torah to the experiences of our people. And he was saying that he wonders if for Holocaust survivors, the very fact that so many of them did not ever get the closure of seeing their tormentors killed or destroyed. In theory, we know they lost the war, but how many survivors really had what is essentially a gift to know that the person who caused all of your suffering is no longer. Okay, it doesn't make you feel better. That's not, it continues to be unfair and continues to be, the pain that they cause doesn't disappear. But there is something that potentially would allow a person to move on from what they suffered when they know that that person is no longer a threat. And that this is just, I think, an incredible example of one of the aspects of the miracle of the crossing of the sea. We spoke about, according to the Imre Yehuda, the ability of a person to think so big and imagine bigger than what they should be able to imagine. So here is another element of the miracle of the Kriyas Yam Suf and the crossing of the Jewish people safely across the sea floor, the seabed, is that the loss of life, as horrific as that is, and we know at our Pesach Seder, we minimize our celebration of the suffering of the Egyptians when we take the grape juice or the wine out of our cups at the Pesach Seder, and that's to minimize. We're not trying to celebrate their suffering. We do, however, need to acknowledge it. And those Jewish people, it seems, needed to see it with their own eyes. They had to say the words that we see in the Torah, and we have to continue to say the words that are written in Az Yashir. They drowned, they were like lead in the water, because that closure was part of the gift, that was part of the miracle of the Jewish peoples leaving Mitzrayim, the Jewish peoples leaving Egypt. One last point that I'll make before we wrap up. How are we doing on time? Okay, perfect. One last point that I wanted to make. I was reading, of course, as I try often, and I think probably a lot of people do, because I like to sort of hear the voice of Rabbi Sachs. Unfortunately, the way that we do it now is by watching old videos of him and reading articles, since he is no longer with us, which is still a tragedy that I think none of us have fully wrapped our heads around, because we've been so busy dealing with so many of the other difficult, horrifically painful things that have been going on. But whenever I feel like I need a little boost, a little, arm around my shoulder, I tend to turn to Rabbi Sachs, because he just has such a comforting way of writing. And I read an article, a brief article that he wrote about this week's Parsha, where he talks about the idea, so many things, like as I mentioned at the beginning, happen in this week's Parsha. It's unbelievable how many stories are told. And it starts with something that you think deserves a Parsha of its own. The crossing of the Yam Suf deserves its own Parsha. And yet after that, we learn about the man, and we learn about the slav, the meat that's given to the Jewish people. And we learn about how they don't have water 2 separate times. One, they put a tree in the water and the water turns sweet in Mara. And much later on, there's no water, and Moshe is told to hit the rock and the water comes out, but it's at that incident, even though that's not where Moshe gets punished, he does exactly what Hashem told him to do. He gets very frustrated with the Jewish people. He's like, had it with them. So challenged by their constant complaining. And then we have the war with Amalek is also in this week's Parsha. And Rabbi Sachs points out, it's so fascinating. He asks a bunch of different questions, but what he basically says is that while at the beginning, like before the Yam Suf, the Jewish people scream out to Hashem and scream at Moshe, why did you bring us here for? Like, now we're just going to die in the desert? What was the point of all of that? Why did you do this to us? And that's kind of a refrain that comes up over and over again during their years in the desert. But in particular, even in this week's Parsha, they've like had it. They're just done. I think some of us can relate to how that feels these days. They just can't handle another challenge. And they just seem to come one right after the other in what seems to be like, I guess, human tradition, that you don't get to recover from the first thing before the second thing hits. And Moshe, Rabbi Sachs points out that there is a difference in the response of the Jewish people in one major incident that takes place in this week's Parsha. In every other incident, we see the Jewish people complaining, crying, they're accusing, they're blaming, they're going through the list of things that we generally all go through when we're faced with something where we're like, I just can't take this anymore. And I can't believe this happened. And why did you let this happen? And how could this have happened? And, we go through our own personal list of complaining and fetching and blaming and shaming and all of that. And the only time that we don't see the Jewish people having that response is in their fight with Amalek. And the fight with Amalek is terrifying. And we all know the place that Amalek has sort of in our Jewish worldview. They're like the worst of the worst. They're worse than the Egyptians. We talk about them. There is a mitzvah to not just wipe out Amalek, right? But to remember what they did. We don't have such a mitzvah. We have a ton of things that help us commemorate what took place in Mitzrayim, but we're actually not allowed to take revenge on the Egyptians. Right? There's a mitzvah not to torture them or not to make their lives miserable. We don't have such a thing with Amalek. It's like the more damage you can cause them, the better. Of course, we don't have this mitzvah today because Amalek is not a recognizable entity. But there's something has to have happened, says Rav Sachs, that force the Jewish people or push the Jewish people to go from being a nation of kvetchers, complainers about everything. They're thirsty, they're hungry, they're scared. Well, what happens? How come when Amalek comes toward the end of this week's Parsha, we do not get a story of the Jewish people? We already know what they're going to say. Why did you take us here, Moshe? Did you intend to kill us here? What are we going to do? We've never fought a war before. We're not soldiers. Like, where's the complaining? Where's the refrain that we're so used to the Jewish people having? And I never thought of that before. And it's a brilliant question. Where do the Jewish people find their inner strength to be able to wage a battle to defend themselves against an enemy that they've never met before? And they're victorious. Says Rabbi Sachs, two things. He says a lot of things. I'm going to share with you two things. Number one, he says, something fundamentally shifted for the Jewish people when they crossed the Yam Suf. And even though we don't necessarily see the impact of it in each incident that takes place immediately following the Yam Suf, he says when they crossed that Rubicon, right, that for them meant that there was no choice but to win. And he talks about how that had to have been part of Hashem's plan, that when Hashem took them the way that he took them and forced them that route and forced the Egyptians to chase them, he was giving them a gift that, as traumatic as it was going to be the seeds for allowing them to become a stronger people. That inevitably, the one thing that almost, I would say guarantees, but at least in this case was a guarantee, that would guarantee that the Jewish people would be convinced that they would be victorious, would not allow anything to stop them, was their not being able to go backwards. Right. And that he talks about in world history, different battles that have been fought, and in Jewish history and in other situations where when people feel that their back is up against the wall and they have no choice. Some of you might know individuals like this. I know I certainly do. When faced with something that you think would knock the average person out, that's when they find their inner strength, right? They've been given, a diagnosis that is very dire. They've been given financial news that is very dire, things that are devastating. And they somehow, all of a sudden, now they're their best version of themselves. And you think like, oh my gosh, but you're usually like, you get knocked out by much easier, much simpler things to handle than this. And somehow when they feel like they have no choice but to fight, that's when a person that's what brings out the best in a person. And that was part of Hashem's plan. The second thing, and that's incidentally, that's why they were able to be victorious in a war that they had no training for, right? They had no training. They had probably limited amounts of weapons. I can't imagine that those are the kinds of things they took from a time. They must have had something in order to be able to fight, but they certainly didn't have the cutting edge weapons. They probably had what was spoiled from the spoils from the Egyptians, but a little unclear what they had and how they were able, what they were able to, to fight with. But the will was there. The will was there because they knew there was no turning back. They couldn't run home to Mitzrayim and say, take us back. We can't fight this war. No, that was over. That whole part of their life was over. And so they had no choice but to win that battle against Amalek. And then the second thing that Rabbi Sachs points out is, okay, wait, now I'm blanking on it. Forgive me. I was doing so well. My brain was really so super functional at that point. Let me just say it again. Let's see if it comes to me. So Rabbi Sachs was saying that the very fact that they had no choice, but they had to cross is what allowed them to win. And then the second point that I wanted to share with you, I apologize. Second point I wanted to share with you is he says there's a major difference in what took place at the Yam Suf and at every other incident until Amalek. The difference is that always Hashem was the one performing the miracle, right? Hashem or Moshe, right? Hashem split the sea. Moshe, was his agent to both open the sea and close it again. When it came to the water, Moshe's hitting a rock or throwing a tree in the water, right? When it came to the man, Hashem was making sure that there was food falling from heaven. The Jewish people were totally passive. They were on the receiving end of God's kindness and God's compassion and Hashem's miracles, but they didn't have to do a thing. All they did was kvetch. All they did was complain. And maybe they davened, it seems, in certainly some of the situations. But when it came to the war with Amalek, that's where a fundamental shift happens, because everything was people-based. Now we know, of course, Hashem was behind the scenes and orchestrating events and making sure that they would be victorious. Had he not wanted them to win, they wouldn't have won. But they had to take matters into their own hands. And that this speaks so much to, I think, something that we can all relate to, the idea that when we feel like we have taken control, even if we know, of course, we should know in the back of our minds, Hashem is, the puppeteer. But when we have no choice but to get our hands dirty and, like we talked about, God forbid, with a diagnosis or with dire financial news, when we recognize that what has to happen next is that I start making phone calls and I start doing research and I start making appointments and I start doing what I need to do, when I feel as though I have some control and I am making a difference and I'm pushing things forward, then that's when things actually happen. And here we see this very delicate balance between a person's effort that they are required to put in, and how important it is for an individual to do that so that they can feel productive and constructive and feel like they're a little bit in control, versus, Hashem's hand, which of course is always guiding events. But that the shift in the Jewish people takes place when they are forced to fight this war, something that I think, we all somehow feel like these days we're engaged in some kind of battle. I'm sure that, God willing, we will all be victorious, but we're facing a lot of different battle fronts, shall we say. And there is something very, I think, comforting about hearing the words of Rabbi Sachs, who obviously faced his own battles, most of which he never shared with anybody, that the ability of a person to be successful, the ability of a person to be victorious, is to shift from being a complainer and a kvetcher and taking matters into our own hands and doing what needs to get done. And when we do that, Hashem's going to help push us along the way, right? We say that Hashem, that if we just open a pitcho shel machat, the hole like an eye of a needle, so small. If we make that effort, then Hashem comes in and opens it like the size of a great big, grand entrance. Like he'll open it for the rest of us. And so just hopefully a little encouragement for us from Rabbi Sachs, and of course from this week's Parsha, as far as not giving up and trying not to complain, even though we have so many things to complain about, and taking matters into our own hands to the best of our ability, and trying to whatever capacity we have to make things just a bit better. And hopefully we trust that Hashem will do the rest. So just a reminder, we spoke a little bit about Az Yashir and why it's a miracle that has to be mentioned every single day. We gave 2 suggestions. One is that it helps remind us that we ask Hashem for help in allowing us to dream bigger, to envision the best version of ourselves, where the Jewish people were miraculously able to do more than what they should have been able to do at the Yam Suf, as well as the idea that the closure that this gave the Jewish people is what allowed them to move on and to be grateful for opportunities when we do have such closure. It's something else we can think about in Az Yashir. And then, of course, we mentioned the ideas from Rabbi Sachs about the difference, the shift in the Jewish people, both that happened once they were able to take matters into their own hands, when they felt like they weren't just passive and they weren't just victims, but they were able to do as opposed to just complain. And that's it. I wish you all a wonderful Shabbos and happy Tu B'Shvat, God willing, on Monday. We will hopefully be having our Tehillim class on Zoom Monday morning, and I look forward to learning with all of you. Thanks so much for being here. Have a great day.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Thanks, everyone. Feel good.